Hey guys, before we start this episode, I just wanted to preface this with a dedication to Judy Cottrell, a wonderful woman of God who went to be with the Lord very recently. She is married to our good friend Dave Cottrell, who is a member of our team here at Embrace the Truth. She had an infectious faith that was just full of life and encouragement. She was funny, she was dedicated, and she was really the kind of person that we'll be talking about later on in this episode, who was a woman after God's own heart and who displayed that in her life in a wonderful way. We miss her terribly. This episode, talking about the nature of what it is to be a woman from a biblical perspective, is dedicated to her.
Welcome to All Rise. Once again, it's me, Derek Caldwell, with Abdu Murray.
I'm here.
And Abdu, we have a great episode today, an awesome guest to talk about a very important thing. And
Not controversial in the least bit.
not controversial. Yeah. This is going to be, everyone's going to agree with this one, and I love those episodes.
Yeah.
But one of the, Zach, the guy behind the camera, who we stopped letting come in front of the camera. You remember why? We don't have to talk about it.
But we edited that out.
But he just had a baby boy, so congrats to Zach.
Yes.
I have a baby girl on the way,
Congrats
which
to
is
you.
one of the reasons, this is now it's like everything's becoming more real. I feel like when you have kids, it definitely does these are no longer abstract things that don't really affect me. These cultural stuff that is affecting young people today. And I mean, it has been for a long time. And of course, I was shaped by the topic of the day, feminism, in many ways I didn't even realize for a long time. So these things are sort of insidious, but important to point out and see. But sometimes it's hard to see things when you've just grown up in a world where they exist, and certain things are accepted as true.
Right. Yeah. And having raised 3 kids, 2 of whom are girls, and of course, talking to my boy about what it means to interact with, treat, and understand the value of women. Coming from a Middle Eastern Lebanese culture, there's some challenges in understanding this in a balanced way, in an important and biblical way. So I'm really eager for this topic, especially since I wrote a book called More Than a White Man's Religion, where the subtitle was Why the Gospel has Never Been Merely White, Male-Centered, or Just Another Religion. So I'm really excited to talk about what we're going to talk about today with our guests. So
yeah, and I just wanted to mention something too, is I know there can be a lot of, I hope people will sort of let down the guards a little bit and hear what our guest today is going to be talking about, because feminism, it is one of those words that it's almost like anti-racism or Black Lives Matter. Like within the word itself, you don't want to be anti that because you've been taught like being anti that. Well, if you're not for this thing called Black Lives Matter, then you don't care about black
lives.
people. Yeah, Black lives. And if you're against feminism, you must be against women. But of course, this has a specific context, a specific history, and an ideology to it. Some of which is, it's impacted a lot of things, but a lot of what it actually is has been somewhat hidden until maybe you get into the belly of the beast a little bit. So without further ado, today we are welcoming our guest, Dr. Carrie Gress. Dr. Gress is a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America, the founder and editor at the online women's magazine theologyofhome.com, the author of 10 books, including the Theology of Home series, the Anti-Mary Exposed, and the one where really, for me, Dr. Gress came on the radar in a big way was The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. And she's with us today to discuss her new, very intriguing book called Something Wicked, Why Feminism Can't Be Fused with Christianity. So Dr. Gress, welcome to All Rise.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with you all.
Yeah, we're looking forward to diving into this. And so one of the first things we wanted to ask you is probably the question that anybody, whether they are all in on the title of your new book, or they're thinking, wait a minute, what? They're going to be thinking this. And then they'd say, look, Dr. Gress, you're a scholar and a professor, and you've written lots of books, had them published. Aren't you the beneficiary of decades of feminism? And then, so why would you call it something wicked? So how would you respond to that kind of a question?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and it's one I get a lot. I think it's come up in probably just about every com box of anything I've ever written.
Yeah.
But I think that, that one of the things that's really interesting to me is just with that question is it presumes that it really is only through feminism that I received my education, that it was feminism that opened the doors to education. And I think we have this kind of framing wrong. In fact, the other day I was on another podcast, and the question was, I know brilliant women, but I also have issues with feminism. How can this be? Like we sort of have bought into this narrative that feminism is what gave women any option, any opportunity, anything good in the culture. And I think that's been one of the things that I've been really researching, is just to see, like, where did that come from, and where did this idea that women weren't educated and couldn't be educated come from? And the history is a lot richer and more interesting. I think the other piece that's fascinating is to see how much has actually really come from the Industrial Revolution,
Mm.
both good and bad. But I think it's more things like my dishwasher and my washing machine and the fact that I can go, I've got DoorDash to feed my children. Those are things that have allowed me the space, and allowed our culture and the space to really be able to not just educate women, but men, second, third, fourth sons that historically never would have been educated either. So I think it's an important question, but I think I call it like a gatekeeper or doorkeeper
Right.
question, because
Yeah.
what it really does is it prevents people from scrutinizing feminism and saying, there's real problems with this. Can we begin to look at this? The other one is sort of the one you were just referring to, that idea of, well, if you don't like feminism, you must really be against women. Or I'm sure one you've heard a lot or will hear is, you're men, you can't talk about this. And I think it's really fascinating, because as Christians, we would never accept that. We would never allow other Christians to just say, well, you can't talk about your religion in a rational way.
Mhm.
Because you've benefited from it, or in a critical way, or in a way that questions it because
Right.
you've benefited from it. So I think it's always amazing to me, because most people would say we have to be critical. We live in an age where we think through things. We have to be rational and critical of things. Just measure them in an appropriate way, except feminism. And that's the one taboo, I think, in the culture that we're really not supposed to touch. So obviously I have, felt the sting of touching something that's so unpopular, but at the same time, I'm really seeing this huge, I've been writing about this for 10 years, and I'm really seeing this huge transition happen where people are talking about it in ways that they never were before. And I know it's not just me. I think been some big changes in the culture. I think men are feeling less controlled and confined in their thoughts about it as well. So it's been really exciting to kind of be watching this unfold, and obviously be given a platform by people like yourself in a way that previously never would have happened. I think people were really closed off to the idea.
Mm.
So I'm grateful to you as men to hosting me today.
Oh, well, grateful to have you. Yeah,
For sure.
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's that really, and it is. Well, we'll get into this a little bit too further on, but even the way it has impacted men, I mentioned kind of even through your book, seeing ways that it's it impacted me in certain ideas, and even now you see that rejection of that culturally, where where there is hope, and there are people even turning to these like sort of ultra traditional forms of Christianity, specifically because they found, and you mentioned it a little bit in your book, this sort of feminist creep into even conservative churches, but obviously the more liberal churches. So there's definitely a lot to get into here. But I thought, to start off with a few like historical and kind of framing questions. We will get into the history in a little bit, but specifically, when you use the term feminism in the book, what exactly are you referring to here? Would you consider this a political movement, a philosophical framework, or a spiritual posture?
Mhm.
All of the
Well, I
above?
think, yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's probably all three. It's certainly a movement that started in the 1790s. And it's easy to sort of watch it progress. There have been obviously different waves. People talk about the first wave, second wave, third and fourth waves of feminism. But by and large, the fact that we can say that there are different waves also indicates that there's a whole arc of a movement that still falls under the umbrella of feminism. So I'm not talking about, what my neighbor thinks about feminism, which might be something, different than me. What I'm talking about is what you can glean from maybe the major leaders of the movement. So starting with Mary Wollstonecraft, going with major figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Simone de Beauvoir, Virginia Woolf, Betty Friedan, Kate Millett, Gloria Steinem, these kinds of major leaders. What is it that they're saying, and sort of extrapolating from that on a philosophical level, the ramifications of it. So that's really the way in which I've done the analysis, very much as a philosopher and a historian, and tried to get into really understanding the currents of the period and what it is that these women were responding to. And I think that's the response, the goal really in many respects, and you can see this from Mary Wollstonecraft on, is this idea of trying to protect women from our vulnerability, and from any way in which it can be used by men. And I think that's the basic thrust. But the problem is that it wasn't quite the right medicine for the real problem. So if you want to sort of boil down feminism into like a basic concept, it's basically men are awful. And then the next piece is women must be just like them. It's sort of this piece of envy that it that's the mechanism that's at the heart of it. And everything else has sort of come out of that. So it's this idea that men have done bad things, but women, in order to be happy or protected, need to become like men. And unfortunately, the models haven't been of good men. They've been of the men that they're supposedly the ones that they revile. So anyway, that's kind of the big picture of it. But I use all of these different elements to really understand it, both theologically, politically, historically, and whatnot. And what's been the engine behind all of it.
If I were to look at, I want to pick up pause on something you said earlier, because I think it's really important to ferret out what feminism was trying to fix or address was protecting women from their own vulnerability, and we're seeing this actually play out in sort of our modern context with people like, for example, J.K. Rowling. Or Rowling, sorry, where she says that one of the reasons why we're trying to make sure that women have their own spaces, strangely enough, but it makes a lot of sense. Women's prisons where men shouldn't be, especially men who are convicted of violent crimes, and men tend to be convicted of violent crimes way more often than women do, or women's only bathrooms, women's only locker rooms, women's only sports. And one of the reasons that she gives, and I think a lot of folks would say, is because we're protecting women based on their physical vulnerabilities, which are real in the sense of just the physical differences between men and women. So can you draw a contrast between what you're talking about and maybe what they were trying to address back in sort of the formative stages of feminism, saying this is a problem, versus what we're seeing today, which is, I think, a legitimate thing to worry about?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way to frame it, because early on you've got someone like Mary Wollstonecraft. She's writing in 1792, the most famous tract that or book on this topic, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And what she's doing, in many respects, her experience is that she had a good friend, and then she had a sister who both were treated terribly by different men. And so she's trying to figure out how it is that women can sort of move away from this vulnerable situation where, it's the case that their children can be taken away from them and they have no custody of their children, and, situations like that. And then, it was interesting when I found a book in 1909 that was written, and it was actually critical of Mary Wollstonecraft, saying, all the things that feminism has promoted have actually not done any of the things that the feminists said that they were going to do. They haven't, because it hasn't fundamentally improved men. It's actually just made women worse. It's tried to make women into something that they fundamentally aren't, and it's denigrated what it means to be a woman while idolizing what it means to be masculine. And I think you can, if you look at the culture, even the last 50 years, where have we talked positively about what it means to be a woman, or what motherhood is meant to look like, and this real idea that if a woman stays home with her children, then she really must not be able to do anything else, and that shouldn't be a priority. And that's been kind of the messaging. But one of the major shifts that happened in the movement was around 1920, when the communists and the feminists decided to join forces. And this is really where we get the International Day of Woman, which is still celebrated, because it was the way in which the communists were trying to court the feminists, because they realized the feminists were angry and very politically engaged and active. And it was largely because of the anger. They realized the importance of making women bitter and angry, because that's when women will be more effective. And in their case, this is what they wanted, the communist revolution to sort of take over the world. But part of that messaging and that idea was that both the feminists and the communists believed that we could get rid of gender altogether, that it was very important to erase the family and certainly Christian faith, but get rid of the way in which we looked at men and women as different. So under communism, of course, abortion becomes rampant. Husbands and wives are actually encouraged, or actually forced, to have different days off so that they can't spend time together. There were all these efforts to try to break up the family. Children are sort of shuttled off to have somebody else take care of during the day. And you see the same effort in feminism simultaneously, of this idea of how do we get rid of gender. And Simone de Beauvoir has that famous line of, woman doesn't become a woman, she's made a woman. Maybe I'm butchering that. But that idea of how do we get rid of gender entirely and erase that becomes very in vogue in the second wave of feminism. And that's really where all these abuses come from. And you can see, this as you kind of creep along the movement, you see, okay, what's the first thing they take away? This idea that home is anything good or valuable. Second thing, husbands are bad. Third thing, our fertility is bad. So our children are really an obstacle to our happiness. And then, of course, you progress up to the trans movement, and the movement is really about hacking off healthy body parts off of women, sterilizing us, essentially, but also, taking away any kind of mark of being a woman. So that's really the effort, and that's why my book is called The End of Woman, because I think that's been the real goal. And this is the amazing thing is that you have someone, like J.K. Rowling, who comes along and says, and notices, like, wait a minute, you told us that this is really what feminism was about, was the promotion of women. How many times have we all heard that? That's what it's supposed to be about. And now you're going to let men into the women's locker room, or you're going to let men participate in women's sports. So you really see that the ideology just went too far. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the pushback. I think if the trans movement had not happened, I don't think we would be having any of this conversation. But I think it overplayed its hand, and everybody suddenly began to see, like, this is complete ideology. This is unhealthy. This is dangerous. And this is really destructive, not only to women, but what we thought was the movement just for women. So yeah, I think it's really complicated. There's a lot of twists and turns, but you can just see how powerful, the marketing has been, and the indoctrination has been, that we can get to this point where we would think, oh yeah, it's a great thing that we have a man competing with women, in the swimming pool or wherever on the track. And
boxing
because there's
ring.
not differences.
In actual fighting, where a man is literally hitting a woman repeatedly, whether it's in MMA or it's in Olympic boxing, which of course things have changed since then. It's funny, as you're talking, I'm thinking about this, this phrase that gained popularity, or infamously, I can't even tell what anymore, depending on how cancel culture works at that particular moment, is TERF, where the word feminism is used in a derogatory word for certain kinds of people who are actually okay, who want to exclude men from women's only spaces, so that men can't be better at being women than women. They call a trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is the idea that women are actually different than men, is somehow a radical idea. So the word feminism is actually appended to a derogatory term, which I find incredibly ironic in light of the fact that it was maybe even the beginning of the feminist movement that got us to the place where you go to a Target, and back when they had, and I think Ashley McGuire talked about this in her book Sex Scandal, where you'd go to the gender neutral section of the clothing in Target. They don't have it anymore, but when they did, you'd go, and all the clothes were either polo shirts, similar to the one I'm wearing now, which are a light blue or gray, and khaki pants, which is basically just the uniform for the Geek Squad. And
Right.
that's considered gender neutral. It's all male.
Yeah. Right. Oh no, I think it's really interesting. Just these different ways you sort of run into the problems with that. How far can this actually go when you see it manifest in a place like Target and it is all male? Just this element of, well, this is only route because young boys, I mean, unless they're really indoctrinated by their mothers, usually, they're not going to wear a skirt. It's very clearly a female kind of element. So it's when we get into these tangibles that I think things, there's an ick factor as well. And I think that's, we see that obviously with drag, we see that, watching, male swimmers and female swimming suits, all of those kinds of elements there that just we know something is not right there, and I think that's really going to end up being the saving grace to a lot of this, where it's opened up a discussion, because it becomes so obvious that something's wrong when you get to those instantiations like Target that you just described.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, in the book you had this really powerful quote from Virginia Woolf that I think, because it goes even to the potency of the history. This was like an era rife with like recreating history as a way to discredit Christianity in many ways.
Yeah.
And the rise of skepticism in the early modern period and up into the modern period. But this quote was really striking to both Abdu and myself. And she wrote, imaginatively, woman is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. She pervades poetry from cover to cover. She is all but absent from history. She dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. In fact, she was the slave of any boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. Some of the most inspired words and profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she could hardly read, scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. So, there's a history in the modern Western world. There's an ancient history to where, again, I think it's hard. It's going to be hard for a lot of people to sort of differentiate, like, what was the real problem? What's the problem we were told about? It seems like there needed to be something done, and we've kind of already talked about that the solution was not the correct solution. But I was wondering if you could spend a little bit more time. I know we touched on it, but what was the actual some of the major issues as you saw them researching?
We'll get back to the show in just a second, but I wanted to tell you about my latest book, Fake ID: How AI and Identity Ideology Are Collapsing Reality and What to Do About It. This is the most urgent book I've ever written about. Now, to tell you a little bit about the book, here's a short trailer. Something is deeply wrong, and we can all feel it. Culture tells us we're nothing but machines. It also tells us we're gods who can reshape reality by sheer will. Both can't be true, so it creates a kind of cultural schizophrenia where we can no longer tell what's authentic from what's artificial, and it's collapsing reality itself. But we're not machines to upgrade. We're not gods whose bodies are playthings or prisons. What we are is something the world is forgetting, but desperately needs to remember. Because only the truth about what we are can restore our sense of what's real. Okay, let's get back to the show.
Well, I would say the first thing is that just to keep in mind that is, sorry, there's so many different ways to tackle that question.
In all of history, what do you think the problems are?
Exactly. My mind's racing. I can answer in about 5 or 6 different directions. So forgive me, but I think Virginia Woolf, what she's doing is she's a mouthpiece of the women at her time and what it is that this kind of narrative that they have been told. And education at that stage is taking on a very, very different tones and understanding. Obviously, literacy is important. And as I mentioned previously, you've got the Industrial Revolution has just happened. The home has been denigrated in a way that has never historically been denigrated, because the home used to be the locus of all family activity. Whether it was the family working together to eat, to be educated, to be entertained. Like that was really, businesses were in the home. All of that was central. And then suddenly the Industrial Revolution comes along, and women no longer have status because of the number of children they have. Because prior to that, they were considered assets to have children. They suddenly became a liability, because what do you do with these children when everybody has to go work in a factory? So I think it's important to keep that kind of the bigger perspective in mind. There also were certainly pockets, England and in many respects is dealing with this kind of new way of thinking from David Hume, who's trying to make everything about property, because he's trying to get rid of all of the scholastic thought from Thomas Aquinas in the medieval period. And he wants to recreate something good, but he can't use good, truth, and beauty. He can't use Aristotle in the Thomistic sense. So he's trying to use something different. And this is where he comes up with the idea of everything is about property. And so if you go back and look at Jane Austen or any kind of film or book from that period, the big thing is that the upper class men and women do not want to make it look like they have to work. Work is something that's really vilified. Property is the key to everyone's wealth. And that idea gets shared sort of with women, because women have dowries because of the way in which, the eldest son gets the property. All of these things get very complicated very quickly. And even something like chastity in England at this period is considered a virtue only because it's seen as a way in which they can tell who the father is and where the property is meant to go. So you can kind of see that confusion. And in my book, Something Wicked, I talk about Hannah More, who is not well known. I knew very little about her, but she ought to be better known, much better known than Mary Wollstonecraft, because she was at her time period. But she was actually still a believer in Christianity, whereas Wollstonecraft was slowly sliding east and leaving her faith, going more into Unitarianism, which is sort of more like deism. There's no Christ, there's no Trinity. Jesus, in fact, she saw as and any kind of pastor or priest, she thought any kind of male mediation, including Jesus's, was a block to a woman's potential. Whereas Hannah More, who's her contemporary, is basically saying, well, why would we want to become like men when be a kind of a cheap imitation, when we can actually be the real thing and be a real woman. And she was deeply involved in abolition. She was very close to William Wilberforce, who eventually got rid of slavery through the Parliament. And so I think it's really interesting when you sort of start seeing what were the other voices and what were they talking about. And I think it was this idea of understanding womanhood as property, and women kind of becoming playthings because they were bored. They didn't work, and their education was somewhat limited. And obviously, someone whom I think education is deeply important for both male and female. One of the things during that period, and I think also up until recently, that we've completely denigrated are the values of the education that does come at home when, say you have a family and you've got homesteaders, or you have a garden. Women learned the things that they needed to learn in order to survive, and it was gardening, it was clothing, it was carding wool and sheep and textiles, all of those kinds of things, storing things up for the winter. So their education wasn't. These weren't just completely mindless creatures.
Right.
But they had the kind of education that they needed for survival. And I think that's what we sort of take for granted. And it's somewhat ironically, because of course now very few of us know anything about growing seasons, seeds,
Right.
textiles, making our own clothing, and we haven't needed to. But you can imagine very quickly that could change, on a dime, and people would have to grow their own food. And most of us would really be sunk, myself included. Despite my best efforts, I'm not a green thumb. But I think that's, one of the things we have to keep in mind is how much this kind of rationalist ideal was taking over. As you mentioned previously, Christianity was trying to be pushed out, and feminism was making the argument that Christianity was enslaving women. And that's what women need to be liberated from, rather than really understanding, okay, here's some things that are objectively bad that we can change legally or with policy. And instead, there was this whole shift that just had to take place in the way that women thought. And that's what we're really dealing with today, is that shift that I think was very detrimental and really has been the source of so many ills that we thought were being fixed, but actually have just really made things worse, I think.
Well, and that's the great irony too of, you mentioned one of the issues with, there was this concern that they were that women were sort of the playthings of men, and then you get you go to the 60s, second wave feminism, the sexual revolution, where it's
Right.
like, I don't know how you trick people into this, but it's like, I know how you can be free. You can become exactly what the sleaziest man in the world wants you to be to him,
Yeah.
and that's
Right.
freedom. But
Yeah.
the history you told there, though, was very interesting because you kind of talked about the 50s housewife and that idea of like what womanhood had sort of, to some people, turned into. And so it was this sort of purposeless, gadget-driven existence to a lot of, it was very materialistic.
Yeah.
And so you sort of had this battle between two types of femininity, neither of which were necessarily the definitely not the Hannah More type of femininity you were
Right.
just talking about.
Right. Well, and that is, I think, really important, because so often in this discussion about feminism, we talk a lot about the more superficial things, like what women should do, or maybe what they should wear, or how they should act, and we completely neglected what's sort of at the deeper core of womanhood, and what does that really mean, especially in light of the Christian faith? What is it that
Yeah.
God has gifted to us? And I think that's the fundamental question. What are we made to be, and not do? And the doing comes from understanding who it is that we're made to be. So if we believe that we're meant to be autonomous, without husbands, without home, without children, and our focus is really meant to be on work, then that obviously makes sense in the culture that we're living with today. That's the goal that feminism has set for us in many respects. The problem is, of course, is that it's not who we are meant to be. And I've actually sort of come up with this an understanding of what that vision of feminism has done to sort of the human female soul. Is it's cubicalized us. It's made us, our emotions are very contained. Our experiences are very limited. There's a lot of loneliness in that. Our relationships are shallow, and if we do have that, we're limited because we can't be procreative in our relationships with men, and even the pet craze, I think, is part of this. And yet at the same time, women have so much more to give on an emotional level, on a spiritual level, and I think it goes back to this idea of really understanding the motherhood, and not just biological motherhood, but also spiritual motherhood, mentoring, education, compassion, all those things that women are so good at, because women are called to give and bring life. That's our fundamental task, and that's mothering, small m, not just biological, but it's something that we need to understand has to happen throughout our whole life. It's not just something that happens when we have children. And I know from my own experience, it was really hard to transition to having children, because I had done whatever I wanted to up until that point. There were no constraints on my time, or certainly constraints to a certain degree on my finances. But as a single woman with a healthy income, it was a really dramatic change to go to being at home, which I chose. But at the same time, just that, very demanding. And then I now have 5 children, and it got much easier with certainly with each subsequent child. But the point being that I think we don't prepare women in any way for motherhood, and this is one of the reasons why it's so hard. Is we don't have that sense of who it is that we're meant to be from the get-go, and we also don't understand how that idea of mothering others works beautifully in the workplace. It works in our communities. It works in our churches. That can be so life-giving and compelling, that in a way that others are drawn to you. Others want to be around you. Others want to feel the love that you have to offer them. And I think that's what we're really missing, and why women are so sort of trapped again in this idea of the emotional cubicle, instead of really understanding the depth and the richness to which we're called, which obviously is also going to include pain and anguish and suffering. But you have both the highs and lows, compared to this fluorescent lit box
Right.
that so many women are trapped in.
Yeah, that whole idea, and I use this imagery before when it comes to young people who don't really feel the sun on their face. Their entire lives are lit
Yeah.
by smartphone screen blue.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
the only light they see. A couple of things come to mind as you were just speaking, and I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the things you mentioned in the very great explanation you gave, because some of the things struck me. So we have a friend, a family friend of ours, who is a wonderful woman, raised her kids. She's successful in many, many ways. I don't believe she's ever had a career in the sense that we think of careers now, as opposed to this wonderful career of being a tremendous mentor to a lot of people. And she runs an organization. Well, she doesn't run. She has a chapter of an organization. I think it's called Apples of Gold, and it's all about mentoring women, especially young women. And so older generation women will help young, like people who are going to be married, are married, or newly married, or whatever it might be. Understand the role of being a wife, being a mother, and all that. So there's this tremendous mentorship that's going on here, which is the need for that kind of of a ministry seems to be, in one sense, I'm so thrilled it's happening, but it's another sense it's sad that it's needed as its own separate thing, as opposed to this thing that happens with people. I gotta say, as a dad, one of the things that challenged me with my son, and I can see it easily challenging women with their daughters, was telling my son, what does it mean to be a man? We have this phrase, be a man. And then he's like, what does that mean? Does that mean be
Right.
aggressive? Does that mean make decisions? Does that mean be stoic? Does that mean try to be a dominant personality? What does that mean? And it means none of those things in specific, although those can be expressions of it. I think the same thing happens with, woman up. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean man up, but you just put two letters in front of man? What does that mean exactly? So this idea of mentorship, of what it means to be a woman, generally speaking, but also a mother, and the value of motherhood. And so that, to me, factors into something else I've seen. And you've probably heard, I'm sure you heard the clip. I can't remember the name of the celebrity who basically said, everybody I know who has children, especially women, are miserable people. And her lack of children is sort of this thing that is like, man, I'm really free because I don't have kids. And a lot of people responded to that saying, wait a minute, this is the greatest joy of my life. Of course there's challenges. Of course you see miserable in the sense that I don't sleep as much and I worry about the welfare of these children and all this stuff, but this is the most important thing I've ever done. It's been a reaction. But that idea that, yes, you should be free to be able to choose to be a career woman versus having kids. But then once you make the choice to have kids, you've sort of made a choice that was a bad choice. You shouldn't have done that because it limited you. So I see this weird, like the choice is yours, but when you make it, it's a bad choice. So the choice really isn't yours. You should only choose the one that I think is valuable to you, and that's part of that story. It feels like. What would your assessment of? And you can push back on anything I said. What do you think about that?
Yeah. No, I am thrilled to hear about your friend starting. You said it's called Golden Apples?
Apples of Gold. Yeah.
Called Apples of Gold. I think it's beautiful because I know this was one of the biggest challenges for me was just to be so isolated. And I remember going to the grocery store and the people that you're putting your children, I had 1.4 small children that I could never go anywhere without all four at the same time. So it was, a lot of work making sure you've got the right people in the right places at the grocery store, so you can actually move away from the entrance. And invariably, the people that were most impatient were the women that were my mother's age. And it was so frustrating because it was just this clear sense of these are the people that are supposed to be helping me, that have been there before, that are supposed to understand the value and the importance of the next generation and curating that, and the importance of family and whatnot. And, just that, and it wasn't a one-off. I mean, this was a very constant trend. And I think we see that now, that it's the boomers and the Gen Xers are the ones who are really still clinging to feminism. It's younger women that I'm seeing don't have the same attachment for whatever reason. I think because they saw a lot of the negative from it. But I think that's one of the reasons why that sounded like wisdom was don't have children. There was a one woman that I quote in the book, Something Wicked, that she's in her 80s, I think, and she says, my best advice for younger women is to never get married, never have children, have a lot of friends, and travel. And, that's all sounds really lovely, but there's an incredible amount of loneliness in that. And I think very few women, when they think about being 80, want to look back on their lives and the only thing that they have to show for it are, passport stamps. And that, because they've traveled a lot of places, and that, not to denigrate those things, but the point is that we're made for so much more, and it has to come through challenges. I mean, this is the beauty of understanding the virtues and vices is, when you have a virtue, it gives you a power to do something that you can't get without actually exercising it, unless it's sort of an innate gift. But the idea of being patient, you are never going to become patient unless you have instances where you are demanded to be patient. And this is something I experienced with my own children and raising them. And the difficulties of early motherhood was, I finally realized, like, all these challenges week after week, like, this is a feature, not a flaw. This is something that I'm being transformed into a much better person, much more compassionate person, a much more humble person, by understanding the limits of my own capacities, but also, that I have the ability to persevere in ways that I never knew about before. So I think that's part of it as well, is just what kind of character do we want? What kind of life and legacy do we want to leave? And, you're not going to leave very much if you haven't done the work of creating fruit in your life. And by that, I mean, leaving those around you better off than when you found them. I think that's a real gift that women have the capacity to use. And I think this is why there's, so many people are so miserable, and especially the loneliness, because women have the ability to sort of create the fabric and the tapestry of a culture or a community, or a church, and say, okay, this person, they just had a baby, let's take care of a family for them, or that person who's a shut-in, we just need to go visit them or invite them to our events, or all of those kinds of things that we're dialed into, I know, in ways that men are not always. They have different gifts. It's not to say they don't have that gift entirely, but it's expressed and used in different ways. So I think that's a really important piece, is just asking that question. When I'm 80 years old, what do I want to look back on my life? What do I want to hold before God as what I did with the gifts that He gave me? And being well traveled, or being able to fit into my skinny jeans is not really what it's meant to be about. I think especially once age and gravity start setting in, there's no one's looking more. So that's that's the important thing, is just really getting back to reality and what it is that we're made to do, and how we're meant to do that in community and not in isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah, reality has this way of, like Ian Malcolm, life finds a way, reality has this way of pressing itself back into, and something you said earlier made me think of, because I love this quote from, I might butcher it, but Saint Maria of Paris, Maria Skobtsova, who, her daughter actually died when her daughter was young, and then she wrote and thought to herself, I guess now I must become a mother to the world. And eventually she died in the very concentration camp that Corrie ten Boom was in, because she became a mother to many of the desolate around Paris. Eventually she was from Russia, but then eventually started helping Jews escape Nazi Germany, because she took this role. So that's like, what a true, like, woman, feminine, whatever spirit in this person, the strength there to do that, like, taking that mothering role and actually applying it to this like dire situation. That's like one example. Not that we're all going to be called to do something that extreme. Thank God there's not always something that extreme going on. But that made me think, getting back to the reality piece, and the reality that's maybe being pressed back on women now, is actually there's something good about motherhood that I'm missing out on. And I think about, they're kind of waking up to the idea that they grew up in a world and were faced with this other, what you call in Something Wicked, you call this shadow church. And specifically this, you talk about, it has its own idols, its own commandments, sacred rites, sacraments. And I want to read this quote because I was really struck by this, because you relate it to the Eucharist, and you say abortion, which is, the ending of motherhood, the abortion takes on a sacredness because it frees women, they say, from the obligations of fertility, allows them to compete for jobs with men, and permits them to remain promiscuous. Feminism is abortion's engine, fueling it with the promise of a level playing field, independence, wealth, and eternal youth. Peter Kreft has pointed out that, unlike the true Savior who said at the Last Supper, "This is my body given up for you," in an abortion, a mother says to her child, "This is your body given up for me."
Wow.
And it's tragic to hear that, and and it's overwhelming when you look at even the numbers of what has happened in the wake of
since Dobbs, yeah.
since Dobbs, and but this idea of reality pressing in, and this shadow church being sort of hopefully forced out, but it really was there, and so it's not just this idea. This idea has consequences, and one of them that so that's part of it. But in this other area, you really talk about you mentioned one of the commandments of feminism that you mentioned is "thou shalt engage the occult." And so one of the things that I wanted to sort of talk about with that last point and then with this point is to show to any of the Christians who are impacted by this and watching this, and I'm sure most of our listeners are Christians. Can you talk a little bit more about the religious side of feminism, and especially this engaging with the occult that happens? Because again, they might think, well, that's not, like you mentioned earlier, my neighbor doesn't engage in the occult. I'm a Christian feminist. Isn't that good? And I went to a very conservative evangelical seminary where, we're feminists here because that's a good thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. I mean, even starting with, did you say it was Saint Margaret of Paris? I've never heard of her, but it's an amazing
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
Mother
Saint
Margaret?
Maria.
Maria, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think you can see that sort of fierce mama bear coming out,
Yeah.
just the beauty, placing it somewhere else. But I think that's the amazing thing is we have this same ferocity in the culture today, but what's it directed at? It's directed at protecting abortion. So it's this amazing inversion of how do we get, I mean, this has been one of kind of my biggest questions, like how do we get to this place where we could do something, convince so many women that something so unnatural, which is that, the breaking of that bond between mother and child was actually, so successful. And I think that goes into, PR and marketing and all kinds of other questions about influence and whatnot, some of which I go into in my book. But I think that the role of the occult is one of those things that I also didn't expect to find early on at all. And it ended up kind of rolling through the whole movement in these varied and fascinating and really disturbing ways. There's a book called Satanic Feminism that was a dissertation written by a Swedish scholar, and it's published by Oxford University Press. And for the longest time, I read this book, and it's like lurid details of what was going on in the 1800s, the rise of theosophy and spiritualism, and it talks about the role of the occult in even in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's life, and the way she used a spirit table, which was a way of sort of conjuring spirits to get answers to questions, and that's really where her idea of the Seneca Falls Convention came from, and that spirit table is still in the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C. So it was not an accidental or just sort of kind of related thing. It was actually very integral, and I trace it back, the first use of it, back to Percy Shelley, who seems like a totally obscure connection to feminism, but it turns out that he was the son-in-law of Mary Wollstonecraft. They never met because she died shortly after her daughter, Mary Godwin, was born, who later became Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So you can sort of see the elements of the romanticism and the Gothic horror and all of those kinds of things in her work already. But Shelley takes his mother-in-law's ideas, which he called the women's revolution, because he's the first one I was able to find that actually speaks of the awfulness of the differences of gender, and he wants to get rid of them entirely. He actually very presciently describes this idea of where there will never be, we no longer recognize gender differences. So he takes that idea from her, and this contempt for men that's very implicit in Wollstonecraft's work. Then he adds to it the ideas of his father-in-law, whom he did know quite well, William Godwin, who was actually more famous than Mary Wollstonecraft at the time. He influenced Marx. And he had this idea that monogamy was a kind of slavery, and he was trying to get rid of monogamy. So Shelley takes that idea and adds it, and he's creating this character named Sithna in one of his poems. The Revolt of Islam is the poem. And then he adds his own sort of spice to it and from his own interest, and this is the occult element. So Sithna is a woman who despises men. She's deeply promiscuous, but she has a relationship with the devil. That's the only relationship that is close to her, and she doesn't have children. And this becomes the model, and you see Sithna, that the model that she was, very influential in theosophy, which was this woman named Madame Blavatsky, who promotes this idea of theosophy, which is sort of this, we would call it very new agey, but it was a very esoteric kind of religion, a blending of different religions and practices. And that gets passed on to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. You can just see this, through and through these three pieces all together. I just kept identifying them. And I think it's very powerful when you start realizing, what happens to a woman when she hates men, she's promiscuous, and she's involved in the occult. Well, obviously, we know that there's going to be a lot of destruction, but that's a pattern that starts with Shelley. And, look at our college campuses now. That these are the hallmarks, I think, of young women. This contempt for men, promiscuity, and, dabbling in horoscopes or manifesting or tarot cards or, whatever the flavor of the month might be. So it's an amazing thing. But the reason, I think, why all three of those appear together over and over again is because each one damages our relationship with God, with the Trinity. If you have contempt for men, you're going to have a very hard time loving God the Father. If you are promiscuous, the Holy Spirit is going to have a very hard time residing in your body. It's as a temple of the Holy Spirit. And then if you're involved in the occult, you're really denigrating your understanding of the authority of Jesus. And so I think that's why those three are always found together in the movement. I think that's really fundamentally what makes it so incompatible with Christianity, is that none of those pieces, which seem to be kind of the bedrock of the movement, can really help. Now, obviously, we know that there are women who are not involved in all of those elements, but I think, if you go back to that core idea of men are contemptible and we want to become just like you, there is usually a core, that one is the one that's harder to hide, and it's harder to say I'm still a feminist without that, because it really promotes this idea of women trying to be like men, being autonomous, and doing all this other damage to relationships and certainly to the community because of that break of the family to begin with.
If you're watching this and enjoying the conversation, we would love for you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so that you don't miss future episodes. Now, believe it or not, about 90% of the people who watch our videos aren't subscribed. And if just a fraction of you hit that button, it would make a big impact. This is one simple, totally free way to support our ministry and help others discover thoughtful Christian content in a culture that's full of conflict and that's searching for meaning. So go ahead, subscribe, like, and share. It really does help us out. And now back to the show. Well, that was, it's funny when we were researching all this stuff and preparing for this interview, I remember thinking about, because I was doing a lot of research for a book that I just came out with a little while ago on identity and AI and sort of the gender ideology stuff that's going on right now. And two of the books that I had read, and I wish one of them was yours, because now that I've read it, I really wish I would have had it. But it was Tara Isabella Burton's Strange Rights. And she also got a book named Self-Made. Well, in Strange Rights, it's interesting because she talks about the bespoke nature of religious expression today, where she talked about the difference between institutional religion and intuitional religion. And so people are still religious. The idea that people are secular in a pure sense is kind of not true. We've abandoned institutional religion in favor of intuitional religion. And one of the things she notes is kind of what you're talking about, is this development of women engaging in the occult and a lot of Wicca and this kind of stuff because of the idea of feminine power and drawing from Mother Earth and all these things, which, by the way, got me to something thinking about as you guys were talking about something. We have this phrase that we like so much, and we use it over and over again about things like, the old country. When we talk about the old country, we call it the motherland. And we use the word mother, except for Samuel L. Jackson, we use the mother in extremely complimentary terms. We almost never use mother in a bad sense, like when someone mothers someone or the motherland or whatever. So we have this innate love of this term, but then we have this rejection of it as this inherently enslaving thing. I don't know. I don't know if I have a question related to that so much as just a comment about we still have this vestigial love of this, and it keeps creeping up no matter how much we try to suppress it.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And that's the idea is that with feminism, again, it's a rejection of the feminine. It's an embracing of the masculine and trying to encourage women and in many respects force women into that and really even denying that gift altogether. And one of the pieces that was really interesting too was just even this idea of, you see it in feminism and in paganism, is this idea that the witch, because she's engaged with power and the dark arts and whatnot, that there's a way in which she's cares better for people. This was just in that movie Hamnet. I don't know if either of you saw that.
Not yet, but it's on the list.
Yeah. I actually wrote a piece about it that I think you would appreciate, because I really think that the Christian patriarch comes through and wins at the end of the day, without being too much of a spoiler alert, but the point is that this is kind of the messaging that we got, was that the feminist knows how to care for women much better than Christians do, or the old-fashioned idea of a mother. And it's really interesting because this is, what it's done is actually is negated motherhood. And this is one of the problems that we're seeing with the mental health crisis, is the fact that because women were told to be like men, so many of our children didn't have the proper attachment that was necessary between the ages of 0 to 3, leading to this, proliferation of what are now called the cluster B pathologies, things like narcissism and borderline personality and whatnot. So anyway, I think it's really interesting that this has been kind of the argument, is that we know how to take care of women and children in the world better, when in fact it's just been a complete breakdown of care. And if you really want, kind of rich, beautiful care, that's going to be, and I know, men are drawn to this, and I've even learned recently they're drawn to it for physiological reasons that aren't sexual per se. Because good women who understand their ordered nature have the capacity to reset the nervous system of men, which you guys might have known that. I never do that. But, this is one of the reasons why, if you look at poetry, you look at song lyrics, what is it that men describe that they love about women? It's never because you're nagging me, or because you are trying to become more like a man, or I love you because of your pantsuit, or, it's always speaking about a woman's tenderness, her kindness, her presence, her wisdom, her calming, peaceful kind of elements. And so you can really see the way that, Satan has exacerbated through things like the fear of missing out, or through things like envy, that has completely distorted our nature. But you're right, there is still something that we're very drawn to about that idea of the motherland, or a well-curated home. We want our homes to feel like a sanctuary. That's not accidental. We don't always know how to go about doing it, but that's also, in many respects, meant to be a foretaste of heaven. So mothers have the capacity to gift these things to the people around them. So you can see very clearly why, snuffing that out would be a goal of Satan, because the fact that there's something so vital and important and obviously life-giving about all of it.
Yeah, there is quite a piece there. I mean, we're both mama's boys. We understand the peace that comes from being back home and getting a hug from your mom. But those things are, I mean, very early on, even when they're talking about, thinking now about having a child for the first time, that skin on skin contact right away, it starts this process whereby you are regulated through the gentle woman in your life.
Yeah.
And that's this balance that I think God has placed there on a very deep level.
Well, I mean, before we get into that, as time runs out here, I wanted to sort of talk about shifting to what is a really Christian view of how we can actually address the issues, is just on the terms of like the things we think about. You use the term mama bear. We don't use that in terms of cuddly and cute and teddy bearish. We mean like someone who is fiercely protective of her cubs. There's a wonderful book called Mama Bear Apologetics about how we can defend the faith and can get our kids to understand these things as a mother. And I remember watching a movie where we had this scene where a woman was talking to her child about their vulnerabilities, and she said a mother's arms are strong when she carries her child. We use a word like strong to usually refer to the male lead of a movie, and she's talking about how strong her arms are when she carries her child. And it's this idea that motherhood actually empowers you as opposed to makes you vulnerable. I was going to make a verb out of something that isn't a verb, vulnerabilize, but I thought better of it at the last second.
I think that's important too, because especially if there are women who, for whatever reason, want to be but can't be mothers, there's still this mothering role that the world so desperately needs that you're able to step into. So that's just kind of an important thing to acknowledge.
Can I just make one more observation on something? I'm going to go really highbrow with the art I'm going to refer to now. Is a movie called Crazy Stupid Love. The premise of this movie is there's a lot of things going on, but where the main character gets divorced and they're trying to figure out their life, this woman and man, and they end up, sort of having this comical way back to their marriage. But there's this character who isn't the main character. It's played by Ryan Gosling. So, super good looking, macho, ripped to shreds, kind of physique and all this stuff. And he is the quintessential womanizer. And he tries to get this guy who just newly divorced to get back in the game by getting the right haircut and being super fit and having the right clothes and saying the charming thing and being like this superficial guy who gets women in bed all the time and all this. And then he finally meets this guy's daughter, and no one knows it. He doesn't know it's his daughter. But she is smart, capable. She wants a family. She wants all the things in the future. She's with this guy, and suddenly he reveals all this superficiality of traditional masculinity. He's like, yeah, but all of that's just junk compared to like what I want. What I want is stability. I want to care for someone and nurture people. So this whole idea of turning women into men because that is freedom, that character, and I got to tell you, I think most men identify with that guy. They're like, that's not freedom. That is utter bondage to superficiality. What you want is to be a father. What you want is to at least, or be, if you can't be a physical father, then be fatherly in some way, to be connected to other people in a way that seems vulnerable. So if you're trying to be more like men, well, I got news for you. Men really like the whole idea of being dads. So, they like the tied down to a family. They like that. I know they don't always act like it, but deep down inside, even the most superficial man wants to be that. So anyway, that's a comment. And our conversation has just sparked a bunch of stuff in me. And this happens on our show time. Sometimes I'm like, oh my goodness, I got to ask her 200 questions more. And I think of it at the end of the show, unfortunately. But
I think as we wrap up, just two things that kind of tie a bow, and obviously highly recommend people buy a copy of Something Wicked. But two things I think would be interesting to hear at the end is, one, for the Christian listeners, what are some of the ways that, because you talk about feminism has infiltrated the churches, in what ways, and so help us see that. And then the other, what is the positive, we've already kind of talked about it, but to sort of send people home with something, maybe a positive Christian vision of being a woman that they can kind of grasp onto.
Okay. I will try to do this. So the first thing is that the real threat, I think, the first problem is that feminism has been framed in such a way where we think that women are savvy and attractive if they're feminists, and if they're not feminists, then they're frumpy and stupid or incapable. I think those are the binaries that we've been offered, and so I think for everybody, the big thing is to sort of jump out of that and realize that that's been set up for us by the elites and by PR and a lot of marketing, and it's not reality. The reality is that when we are Christian women and ordered, we actually have a lot more potential and gifts that come about because we're following virtue, because we're following human nature, because we're God is leading us to where it is, where the grace filled life is. So that's important. But the big thing has been, I've seen, especially among Protestant Christians, is this idea of really getting into the occult, whether it's and it's very subtle and it seems very fluffy, but it's been more things like manifesting, reading your horoscope, those kinds of elements that I've seen it get integrated. And then suddenly the next thing it's almost like those are little gateway drugs. The next thing a couple is divorcing, and maybe there are problems to begin with, but it doesn't help when you've got this whole sort of feminist movement behind you that's telling you, again, men are contemptible and we need to become just like them. This whole role of envy. So I think that identification of envy in our lives as any kind of woman really needs to be there, because I think men struggle most with lust, women struggle most with envy. And we have to call that out and really start grappling with that in our own way and really understand that God has a mission for me. And I don't need to compare myself to other women or to other men, all the time. So that's really important. And then, sorry, what was the second question?
What's a better vision for how, if we care about the dignity and equality of
Oh,
women,
yeah.
what's a better
Okay,
vision?
so almost any vision actually is better. Telling women to become men, be involved in the occult, and being promiscuous, I think, is a really great place to start, is avoiding that. And I think that's one of the simple answers, is we need to stop using the word feminism and stop trying to redefine it, because it hasn't worked. This has been sort of even in the pro-life movement, this has been really kind of the default thing, is if we just made feminism better, then everyone will become pro-life. And, even just, I think it was this morning, I just saw an article that said, abortions have gone up since Roe, even since last year. And this is not working. We need to get a new message. And
since Dobbs,
it makes sense. You can't beat an ideology with the ideology. You're not going to say, well, we need more Nazis so we can get rid of Nazism. We need more communists so we can get rid of communists. But this has somehow been the default vision of the pro-life movement, and that we need to get rid of. And I think that's changing a lot dramatically as well. So that's exciting. But I think we have just this incredible opportunity to really start living something that works with our nature. It's almost like it's downhill. Feminism has been this uphill push of angst, irritation, frustration, bitterness, envy, and by design. I mean, that's one of the chapters in the book, is how much our emotions have been manipulated as women so that we will become more politically active and angry. But amazing things happen when you begin to realize, like, I don't have to be angry all the time. Your stress level goes down, your cortisol goes down, all of your adrenal system is healthy. And suddenly, I think not only do we as individuals feel better and physically are better, but everyone around us becomes better, because you become a healthy, ordered person. And I think this is the real damage that we need to even recognize feminism has done to us biologically. Obviously spiritually it's been incredibly damaging, emotionally, relationship wise, but biologically it's been damaging as well. So anyway, I would say there's been nothing better in all of history for women than Christianity. And, I think that might sound cliche, or it might sound even unserious to people. But if you start really looking back at what it has done, if you understand, the Roman world, the pagan world, where women truly were playthings, where infanticide was very common, where women were slaves and enslaved, all the time, polygamy, all of these things. Christianity is the thing that came along and said, not only are we going to treat women this way, but we need men to become better men in a way that allows women to be better women. So I think it's got to be something that both men and women begin to understand the dynamic of what it is that we've been told. I think we're all going to be recovering from feminism for a long time. But we've got to start there in terms of just getting rid of it and stop trying to make it something that it can never be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Good
that's
stuff.
awesome. Well, thank you for joining us for this. I know there's a lot more we
Yeah, could have gone into.
in these notes. It's just such a really meaningful and full book that helps to correct a lot of things. So again, would highly recommend it. Something Wicked by Dr. Carrie Gress. And Abdu, to close us out, do you have any? I always forget what these are. Closing arguments.
Closing
There
arguments,
we
yeah.
go.
Well, it's more of just a closing statement here. Is I think as we're talking here, I think about in those last moments and those last comments Dr. Gress gave us is I'm thinking that John Greenleaf Whittier poem where he talks about that idea of being still and calm and understanding what your role actually is and the decreased cortisol and all this. And he sort of almost presciently said, breathe the heat of our desire, thy coolness and thy balm. Let sense be dumb, let flesh retire. Breathe through the earthquake, wind, and fire, O still small voice of calm. Is that we have all this sound and all this fury and all this stuff, when the reality is we have this ancient book that has this wonderful message. And when you look at the first centuries of Christianity, as Michael Kruger pointed out, it was being made fun of by the pagans, by the Romans, by the Greeks, as a religion. This religion of Christ was made fun of as a religion of women and children, because women and children were flocking to it, because they saw a sense of equality that was not offered to them in their pagan forebears. And now we're going back to that T.S. Eliot line. We are a society that advances progressively backwards. Over and over again. And if we just go back to what women saw in the first few centuries of the Christian movement and saw their value in this whole thing, and then particularly this man who spoke to them and talked about them and did things in their lives the way that we could only dream of now, and we've drowned out, I think we would go back to a time when we're progressively advancing forward as opposed to backwards. So anyway, thank you, Dr. Gress, for an incredibly great conversation about 100 questions. I could have asked you more, but the good news is she wrote a whole book about it, and we'll have links in the notes for people to get some more detail on that. I hope people enjoy this and get something out of this conversation. I know I did.
All right. Well, with that, do you want to say it?
The defense rests.